In his present mood, it obviously did not occur to his father to open the other of the double doors so that Gregor would have enough space to get through. He was merely fixed on the idea that Gregor should be got back into his room as quickly as possible. Nor would he ever have allowed Gregor the time to get himself upright as preparation for getting through the doorway. What he did, making more noise than ever, was to drive Gregor forward all the harder, as if there had been nothing in the way. It sounded to Gregor as if there were now more than one father behind him. It was not a pleasant experience, and Gregor pushed himself into the doorway without regard for what might happen. One side of his body lifted itself. He lay at an angle in the doorway, one flank scraped on the white door, and was painfully injured, leaving vile brown flecks on it. Soon he was stuck fast, and would not have been able to move at all by himself. The little legs along one side hung quivering in the air, while those on the other side were pressed painfully against the ground. Then his father gave him a hefty shove from behind, which released him from where he was held, and sent him flying, and heavily bleeding, deep into his room. The door was slammed shut with the stick. Then, finally, all was quiet. It was not until it was getting dark that evening that Gregor awoke from his deep and coma-like sleep. He would have woken soon afterwards anyway, even if he hadn't been disturbed, as he had had enough sleep and felt fully rested. But he had the impression that some hurried steps and the sound of the door leading into the front room, being carefully shut, had woken him. The light from the electric street lamps shone palely here and there onto the ceiling and tops of the furniture, but down below, where Gregor was, it was dark. He pushed himself over to the door, feeling his way clumsily with his antennae, of which he was now beginning to learn the value, in order to see what had been happening there. The whole of his left side seemed like one painfully stretched scar, and he limped badly on his 2 rows of legs. One of the legs had been badly injured in the events of that morning. It was nearly a miracle that only one of them had been, and dragged along lifelessly. It was only when he had reached the door that he realised what it actually was that had drawn him over to it. It was the smell of something to eat. By the door there was a dish filled with sweetened milk and little pieces of white bread floating in it. He was so pleased he almost laughed, as he was even hungrier than he had been that morning, and immediately dipped his head into the milk, nearly covering his eyes with it. But he soon drew his head back again in disappointment. Not only did the pain in his tender left side make it difficult to eat the food, he was only able to eat it if his whole body worked together as a snuffling whole. But the milk did not taste at all nice. Milk like this was normally his favourite drink, and his sister had certainly left it there for him because of that. But he turned, almost against his own will, away from the dish and crawled back into the centre of the room. Through the crack in the door, Gregor could see that the gas had been lit in the living room. His father at this time would normally be sat with his evening paper, reading it out in a loud voice to Gregor's mother, and sometimes to his sister, but there was now not a sound to be heard. Gregor's sister would often write and tell him about this reading, but maybe his father had lost the habit in recent times. It was so quiet all around, too, even though there must have been somebody in the flat. "What a quiet life it is the family lead," said Gregor to himself, and, gazing into the darkness, felt a great pride that he was able to provide a life like that in such a nice home for his sister and parents. But what now, if all this peace and wealth and comfort should come to a horrible and frightening end? That was something that Gregor did not want to think about too much, so he started to move about, crawling up and down the room. Once, during that long evening, the door on one side of the room was opened very slightly and hurriedly closed again. Later on, the door on the other side did the same. It seemed that someone needed to enter the room, but thought better of it. Gregor went and waited immediately by the door, resolved either to bring the timorous visitor into the room in some way, or at least to find out who it was. But the door was opened no more that night, and Gregor waited in vain. The previous morning, while the doors were locked, everyone had wanted to get in there to him. But now that he'd opened up one of the doors, and the other had clearly been unlocked sometime during the day, no one came. And the keys were in the other sides. It was not until late at night that the gaslight in the living room was put out, and now it was easy to see that his parents and sister had stayed awake all that time, as they all could be distinctly heard as they went away together on tiptoe. It was clear that no one would come into Gregor's room anymore until morning. That gave him plenty of time to think undisturbed about how he would have to rearrange his life. For some reason, the tall, empty room where he was forced to remain made him feel uneasy as he lay there, flat on the floor, even though he had been living in it for 5 years. Hardly aware of what he was doing, other than a slight feeling of shame, he hurried under the couch. It pressed down on his back a little, and he was no longer able to lift his head, but he nonetheless felt immediately at ease, and his only regret was that his body was too broad to get it all underneath. He spent the whole night there. Some of the time he passed in a light sleep, although he frequently woke from it in alarm because of his hunger, and some of the time was spent in worries and vague hopes, which, however, always led to the same conclusion. For the time being, he must remain calm. He must show patience and the greatest consideration, so that his family could bear the unpleasantness that he, in his present condition, was forced to impose on them. Gregor soon had the opportunity to test the strength of his decisions. As early as the next morning, almost before the night had ended, his sister, nearly fully dressed, opened the door from the front room and looked anxiously in. She did not see him straight away, but when she did notice him under the couch, he had to be somewhere, for God's sakes. He couldn't have flown away. She was so shocked that she lost control of herself and slammed the door shut again from the outside. But she seemed to regret her behaviour, as she opened the door again straight away and came in on tiptoe, as if entering the room of someone seriously ill, or even of a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head forwards, right to the edge of the couch, and watched her. Would she notice that he had left the milk as it was, realise that it was not from any lack of hunger, and bring him in some other food that was more suitable? If she didn't do it herself, he would rather go hungry than draw her attention to it, although he did feel a terrible urge to rush forward from under the couch, throw himself at his sister's feet and beg her for something good to eat. However, his sister noticed the full dish immediately, and looked at it and the few drops of milk splashed around it with some surprise. She immediately picked it up, using a rag, not her bare hands, and carried it out. Gregor was extremely curious as to what she would bring in its place, imagining the wildest possibilities, but he never could have guessed what his sister, in her goodness, actually did bring. In order to test his taste, she brought him a whole selection of things, all spread out on an old newspaper. There were old, half-rotten vegetables, bones from the evening meal, covered in white sauce that had gone hard, a few raisins and almonds, some cheese that Gregor had declared inedible 2 days before, a dry roll with some bread spread with butter and salt. As well as all that, she had poured some water into the dish, which had probably been permanently set aside for Gregor's use, and placed it beside them. Then, out of consideration for Gregor's feelings, as she knew that he would not eat in front of her, she hurried out again, and even turned the key in the lock, so that Gregor would know he could make things as comfortable for himself as he liked. Gregor's little legs whirred. At last, he could eat. What's more, his injuries must already have completely healed, as he found no difficulty in moving. This amazed him, as more than a month earlier he had cut his finger slightly with a knife. He thought of how his finger had still hurt the day before yesterday. "Am I less sensitive than I used to be then?" he thought, and was already sucking greedily at the cheese, which had immediately, almost compellingly, attracted him much more than the other foods on the newspaper. Quickly, one after another, his eyes watering with pleasure, he consumed the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh foods, on the other hand, he didn't like at all, and even dragged the things he did want to eat a little way away from them, because he couldn't stand the smell. Long after he'd finished eating, and lay lethargic in the same place, his sister slowly turned the key in the lock as a sign to him that he should withdraw. He was immediately startled, although he had been half asleep, and he hurried back under the couch. But he needed great self-control to stay there, even for the short time that his sister was in the room, as eating so much food had rounded out his body a little, and he could hardly breathe in that narrow space. Half suffocating, he watched with bulging eyes as his sister unself-consciously took a broom and swept up the leftovers, mixing them in with the food he'd not even touched at all, as if it could not be used any more. She quickly dropped it all into a bin, closed it with its wooden lid, and carried everything out. She'd hardly turned her back before Gregor came out again from under the couch and stretched himself. This was how Gregor received his food each day now, once in the morning while his parents and the maid were still asleep, and the second time after everyone had eaten their meal at midday, as his parents would sleep for a little while then as well, and Gregor's sister would send the maid away on some errand. Gregor's father and mother certainly did not want him to starve either, but perhaps it would have been more than they could stand to have any more experience of his feeding than being told about it, and perhaps his sister wanted to spare them what distress she could, as they were indeed suffering enough. It was impossible for Gregor to find out what they had told the doctor and the locksmith that first morning to get them out of the flat, as nobody could understand him. Nobody, not even his sister, thought that he could understand them. So he had to be content to hear his sister's sighs and appeals to the saints as she moved about his room. It was only later, when she'd become a little more used to everything — there was, of course, no question of her ever becoming fully used to the situation — that Gregor would sometimes catch a friendly comment, or at least a comment that could be construed as friendly. "He's enjoyed his dinner today," she might say, when he had diligently cleared away all of the food left for him, or if he left most of it, which slowly became more and more frequent, she would often say, sadly, "Now everything's just been left there again." Although Gregor wasn't able to hear any news directly, he did listen to much of what was said in the next rooms, and whenever he heard anyone speaking, he would scurry straight to the appropriate door and press his whole body against it. There was seldom any conversation, especially at first, that was not about him in some way, even if it was only in secret. For 2 whole days, all the talk at every mealtime was about what they should do now. But even between meals, they spoke about the same subject, as there were always at least 2 members of the family at home. Nobody wanted to be at home by themselves, and it was out of the question to leave the flat entirely empty. And, on the very first day, the maid had fallen to her knees and begged Gregor's mother to let her go without delay. It was not very clear how much she knew of what had happened, but she left within a quarter of an hour, tearfully thanking Gregor's mother for her dismissal, as if she'd done her an enormous service. She even swore emphatically not to tell anyone the slightest about what had happened, even though no one had asked that of her. Now, Gregor's sister also had to help his mother with the cooking, although that was not so much bother, as no one ate very much. Gregor often heard how one of them would unsuccessfully urge another to eat, and receive no more answer than, "No thanks, I've had enough," or something similar. No one drank very much either. His sister would sometimes ask his father whether he would like a beer, hoping for the chance to go and fetch it herself. When his father had said nothing, she would add, so that he would not feel selfish, that she could send the housekeeper for it. But then her father would close the matter with a big loud "no," and no more would be said.